Perfect. So hello everybody. My name is Declan, and that was Arabella that was speaking just a second ago. We'll be obviously presenting the webinar today. I'm going to start by presenting just a very brief presentation around social prescribing generally, and then the DHI kind of specialist social prescribing service, which I work in, and that's the service that's kind of facilitating this webinar. As I said before, if you have any questions or anything that come up during the webinar, please feel free to kind of post them in real time, and I'll kind of monitor them and we'll circle back to them at the end. We'll have some time set aside for that. If you guys bear with me just a second while I start sharing screen, and we'll go from there. Lovely. So, as I said, my name's Declan, and I work as a social prescriber within the specialist social prescribing service that's run by DHI. For those that are new to social prescribing, there are a few ways that we kind of use to find the concept. There are a couple of almost kind of co-opted terms for it. So social prescribing can refer to both the kind of mechanism of linking individuals to services and to activities in the community with the aim to increase their well-being and to improve their general health by focusing on non-medical needs. And it is very much an emphasis on the non-medical side of well-being that social prescribing really focuses on. Some people use the terms kind of social prescribing and signposting kind of indistinctly, as if perhaps myself telling someone about an activity is a social prescription, as it were. But it's also, I suppose, the kind of more holistic service that incorporates a lot of the different aspects that I'm going to speak about today. Social prescribing is seen by many as a kind of social movement, really, to tackle health inequalities by focusing on the economic and environmental factors which impact people's health and shape the kind of conditions that they are born into, grow up, live in, work, and age in. For us, social prescribing is about connecting and developing. It's about the connection between the service user, and the link worker that creates the environment for an open and an honest conversation about what matters to them. It's about connecting people with what matters most to them, what's important to them, and what areas that they might want to address. Social prescribing is about developing, and that's developing people's confidence and self-belief, internal resources, developing their strengths and motivation to access help and sustain behavior change. It's much more than a transaction, or it should be much more than a transaction of kind of information and that kind of idea of just a social prescription. It can be, and it should be, a kind of transformational intervention. And as practitioners, we're lucky enough, or I'm lucky enough, to see that on quite a daily basis. The exchange of information that we do is one key aspect, and the other aspects are the motivational work and the kind of removal of barriers to services that we do alongside and kind of on behalf of clients. So very much a kind of focus on collaborative, client-centered and holistic. So we use a tool which is up on screen now called the Wellbeing Star. And this is a licensed tool that we pay for to use to explore the different realms of life. So we've got mental health, lifestyle, self-care, managing symptoms, work, hobbies and volunteering, finances, housing, and kind of social. I'll use the term social relationships there because it's perhaps a little bit confusing with, it's not about Twitter or Facebook, but it's about the social and kind of emotional relationships that people have in their lives. So we use this to look at the different aspects of someone's life, and we use it as a prompt to examine which areas perhaps someone might want to look at, which areas that they want to address. But it also is a really good tool to be able to look at what is really positive for someone, and to identify the strengths in a client's kind of life, and what brings them positivity, as well as the things that they might want to address. And we can then kind of, I suppose, build on the positives, the idea being that we build on the positives and perhaps address the things that are being perhaps detrimental to their well-being. There is a mainstream service, the social prescribing service that runs in Baines, that DHI run, and that is based in GP surgeries, and that's open to anyone with a Baines GP. So that is kind of social prescribing more generally. I suppose that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the theoretical underpinnings, I guess you could say. And there is a mainstream service for anyone, as I said, with a Baines GP. From here on in, for the next kind of 5 minutes or so, I'm going to be speaking about the specialist social prescribing service, which is was created originally to support people whilst they were waiting for an autism assessment. It was kind of started and launched in May of 2021. And originally, as I said, it was purely for people on the waiting list for either a triage assessment or a full assessment with BAS. Since the launch and the pilot, the funding has been extended for an additional 12 months. And as part of that, we can now work with people who have a diagnosis and live in Baines. So it's both a kind of pre and now post-diagnosis kind of service. The underpinnings of this service are very much the same as the mainstream service, and kind of all of the things that I spoke through earlier, in terms of a kind of real focus on the non-medical side of their well-being, and very much a holistic and collaborative approach, but with I suppose a specific clientele now. One of the key things that is perhaps slightly different or slightly more salient and more important for my work within this service specifically, is that middle kind of bullet point on my slide, which is the kind of seeking to remove barriers and provide clients with bespoke support to access appropriate mainstream services. So where people may not be able to access specialist or kind of diagnosis contingent services, part of my role, and a large part of my role, is to help people access mainstream services in the best way for them, and kind of in the way that they would like to. So what that might look like, after receiving a referral often from BAS or the HCRG social care team, I'll reach out to the client, often by email to start with, if possible, to establish what kind of contact preferences someone might have, and to arrange an initial appointment. From there, we have a triage appointment where we get to know each other really, and discuss the service and check to kind of make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of what it might be that the client wants to address, and what I might be able to kind of help with. We will also at that point complete a wellbeing star, which, as I said before, provides a really good, useful framework for exploring different areas of life that kind of social prescribing can have an impact on, looking at both the things that perhaps a client wants to address, and also their strengths and what it is they enjoy and what brings them positivity. As part of that initial appointment, we will together kind of identify some kind of perhaps some key goals based on what the client wants to address and wants to kind of work on, and put together an action plan of sorts of perhaps kind of accessing a service or improving a certain realm on the wellbeing style, and we'll create an action plan together to kind of move forward on that. The time in between sessions is often spent kind of gathering information to share with the client, or completing a referral if that's kind of appropriate and helpful. That's where this work with mainstream services really kind of becomes quite key. And it might be that it's facilitating a kind of three-way introductory meeting with a new service or a service new to a client, to ease them in and to make them feel more comfortable with accessing that. The follow-up appointments will be spent checking in really on the action plan that we've created, and identifying any barriers. And again, that almost kind of a semi-circular thing where it might be that I go back and liaise further with services if needed. After, hopefully, the kind of we've made some progress on the client's goals, and we get to the final appointment, we have a bit of a recap really, and a bit of a check-in on what we've done and the impact that that's had, and we'll create a second wellbeing star to gauge really, the progress, and just to I found that actually myself, the second wellbeing star, a really positive tool and a really positive aspect of it, because it's often then people kind of think, oh, actually that's been very kind of impactful in this, or I've gone from a 1 to a 3. I know people don't often think like that, but there has been kind of almost a little measurable progress, which is really nice to see. Perfect. So I'll just leave a few quotes up there with regards to the service. Thank you for your time. I'm going to hand over to Arabella now, who's going to speak about her experience with social prescribing, but I'll leave her to introduce herself. So thank you everyone for listening. I'll hide myself and I'll stop sharing screen now and hand over to you, Arabella.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Declan, and thanks for sharing all of that. And big thanks to everyone who's sort of put in the chat box as well what brings them here. So my name's Arabella, and I'm here to talk to you today about my own social prescribing story, why social prescribing was so effective in helping me as an autistic person who experiences mental ill health. So what I want to share with you today is the profound difference that social prescribing made to me, to my mental health, and even to my future thereafter, in a way that 20 odd years of working on a purely medical approach had no chance of achieving. So I'm really pleased to share a little bit. My experience with social prescribing was, and I should have checked, but I think 2016-17. So I'm so excited to see that there's this service running for specifically to support autistic people. And I've just seen, oh, Rachel from Kooth is here. Awesome. Welcome. Okay, so let me take you through. I've got a few slides. So here am I with my two amazing daughters in about 2015-16, looking well and happy, and it was Mother's Day and I was being spoilt rotten by my children. But under the surface, everything was actually quite fragile. So when you look at me, as most people will say, and I've literally heard people say this, that I don't look autistic. Well, one of the wonderful things was that my daughter Lucia on the right with the red scarf, darker red scarf, was diagnosed as autistic when she was 12. And that really helped me understand what diagnosis in women looks like. And that was the sort of trigger for me to suddenly realize that my own many years of mental health were maybe due to the fact that I had autism myself. So by this stage, had already had a diagnosis, which is an amazing thing. And I know this service works particularly with people on the way to the diagnosis. So I was diagnosed at the age of 37, that's 10 years ago now. And here I was maybe 4 years into my diagnosis. Now, on the one hand, I got a diagnosis, just to sort of acknowledge my privileges in this moment, I had a diagnosis, which is an amazing thing. Here I am, a white woman with, I'd had access to education up to degree level and 2 amazing children. And to help you understand my unique case, and every case is unique, I'd been a single parent for many years. Both of my children needed care of different sorts. So for Lucia, her autism had meant that school was really challenging for her, and she'd spent maybe half her childhood not accessing school. And then my other daughter, Anna, is deaf. And that had given us, it just changes things, as you'll know, when you've got these additional things. So I'd been very focused on being a parent. I'd become a parent quite young, at the age of 22. And I'd had, as I mentioned, quite a few decades, 2 decades of mental health, which I'll come to, but also I'd had a lot of experience of trauma, which is very, very common in people with autism. So I was at that time doing some part-time consultancy work in a health and social care organization. Our lives had been all about health and social care. And when I was able to work, that's really what I did. But one day, the wheels fell off my ability to keep going. I quietly stepped out of the office and picking up all my things and just took myself to the car, and really, without quite knowing what I was doing, kept driving as far away from the office as I could, knowing that this was not ideal, but knowing this was all I could do. And if you keep driving, as we all know in this area, if we're in the Bath area, or you keep driving, you eventually hit Weston-super-Mare, you can go no further. And I found myself standing on the beach, aware that I was really unwell, uniquely unwell in a way that I hadn't been over various years of experiencing mental ill health. I felt that I would probably need a couple of days off work, but a couple of days turned into 2 weeks, turned into 2 years. So social prescribing was crucial for changing things. Let me walk you through. So I did get help for my mental health following that incident at Weston-super-Mare. I was experiencing complex post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, acute anxiety, suicidal ideation, severe depression, chronic fatigue, stimming and tics, and pre-intentional speech. So those last ones, the last 2 you'll be maybe familiar with, but a lot of pre-intentional speech, whether I was in private or in public, so sort of tics. So this is sadly remarkably common for people with autism. And the impact on me was significant. So I kind of abandoned my work. I hadn't managed to attain for myself a proper contract, and there was no sick leave. So I was financially adrift from that day onwards, unable to concentrate or make decisions, extremely exhausted and in bed, confusion, tearfulness in public, a real cycling of fight, flight, freeze and fawn, completely unable to consider to work or consider applying for work, which is complex when you suddenly are now reliant on benefits, struggling with very basic tasks of home, garden, parenting, and self-care. My debt built up very quickly to the point where I'd reached insolvency. And my older daughter had recently moved out, and my 16-year-old daughter effectively became a young carer, taking a job after school, as the universal credit was, it left us with £25 a month after our rent. and my PIP applications had been rejected. So you might think, help, golly, quickly get some medical help. Well, let me just share with you a little bit about what I felt was available to me at that time. So I had been on and off essentially antidepressants of various sorts, really since I was in my early 20s. And the thing is that for many of us with autism, those medications come with, you know, maybe slightly more side effects than for neurotypical people. I'm not sure. There's good research that our physiologies are maybe slightly more sensitive for autistic people. But also, it seemed like working with a GP, there was a constant hope that the right medicine would solve the problem. And I had felt that that wasn't the case, particularly as, remember, by this stage, I was now a few years into having an autism diagnosis. The thing about working with the GP only was that there was no action plan. I was dependent entirely on the GP to sort of try to tinker with my neurochemistry without helping me establish what my role was going to be in my recovery. And really, this had not done anyone any favors. I can look back now and say I held a lot together to be able to parent my children. And it's no coincidence that this breakdown happened as they became more independent. So remember, for autistic people, we mask, when we need to, and we hold things together. We've got this incredible capacity, but it leads to burnout. So were antidepressants going to be helpful? Well, I spoke to my GP and said, I didn't feel that that was going to be necessarily the case. And she was amazing and said that if I was willing to contact her at any point, or 999 at any point, if I felt that, for example, I was a danger to myself or anyone else, then she was willing to go along a non-pharmaceutical route. And what she wanted to try was this new thing called social prescribing, but also for me to access IAP, so Baines talking therapies. So let's just check in on what we mean by autism. This picture is so helpful for me. This is the picture on my left, the sort of busier brain. This is Temple Grandin, a real advocate for autism, an autistic engineer, a woman. Look her up if you haven't already. She's amazing and speaks so clearly about living with autism. On the other side, we have an MRI scan of a neurotypical brain. Now, this is sort of simplified science, but I want you to see that while all of that kind of neural activity in Temple Grandin's brain, I kind of like to think that's all her genius, and she is, really incredible. It's also sensory processing, working out social environs. That's why I asked you, please let me know why you're here, so that for theory of mind, I kind of know who's in the room and what it is that we're talking about. And that's very exhausting. This is a lot of battery burn that happens. And that's one of the reasons that as autistic people, we get very exhausted. Now, we're all really different. So what I want to share is my unique story of social prescribing and how it helped me to bring my brilliant autistic brain into the center of how I was going to design my life and my mental health recovery going forward. So my mental health recovery was a patchwork quilt of which social prescribing was a part. So I've mentioned my amazing GP. We met every 1 to 2 months for 3 years. She was such an ally to me, and I will always be grateful to her. I also had autism specialist social workers over time. Now, again, if I hadn't had a diagnosis that I was able to share, then I wouldn't have had access to that help. I did have mental health reablement because of my acute suicidal ideation. And that was really about helping me begin to sort of get out of bed and do the basics of sort of caring for myself and my home. I also was referred for employment inclusion with a work coach, which I'll talk about later. I had a PA, a personal assistant, via direct payment for a year. Again, that was to help with sort of basic self-care. BAS were amazing. They gave me 2 sessions, and they were the ones who really brokered my connection with what was then Virgin Care, which provided all of those services. And then I did try to access Bain's talking therapies. I was not well enough to access the workshops at that time, and I was assessed for CBT, but found to be well and not in need of it. Again, this is maybe to do with how, as autistic people, we struggle to let people know how we really are, and particularly when we're very kind of cued to, make everyone feel that everything is okay with us. So in my second assessment, the session, the assessor said, it's just been fascinating talking with you, Arabella. It's just great. And as I was leaving the assessment, I had my hand on the door. I said goodbye, saying, I don't understand why I haven't been referred for CBT. And the assessor said to me, oh, I've meant to ask you, I've got something on my form. Have you had any thoughts of suicide in the last few weeks? Now, I'd been referred for acute suicidal ideation, and I just said, no, I'm fine, thank you. The reason being was that I just felt there was such a distance between myself and, what was being asked of me at that moment. So now we come to, so I want to say thanks to all, everyone who worked with me there, because it was amazing, the support that I got from these services. But really I became aware that I was going to have to do a lot of the work myself. Now, being autistic and understanding the power of our special interests, I decided to make neuropsychology a special interest. I studied how the brain works. I did a cognitive-based mindfulness therapy course, and then started practicing mindfulness, which was amazing, but not for when you've got acute trauma. It's a bit down the line. Daily journaling. I learned about trauma and trauma release experience. I started practicing Qigong off the internet. I invested in a Fitbit so that I could kind of track my steps and so on. So, our autism is, it really is a gift in so many ways. There's the social model of disability that says that disability isn't with us, it's with the way that society treats us. So that's why having a diagnosis has been so helpful for me, because it's allowed me to start to kind of understand my brain, and also how trauma affects us as autistic people. And my social work was really helpful in identifying that. So I mentioned that my GP had suggested social prescribing. So let's leap into that. So first of all, I think my amazing social prescribing link worker, Diane, I think, if I remember rightly, she tried to phone me a few times, and I didn't pick up. I'm not good with the phone, what can I say? She persisted, bless her, and reached out with email or text, and eventually, kind of by not giving up, not just sending me a letter and waiting for me to take action, I kind of made contact with her. And I love how Declan, you've got your kind of check-in on how people like to communicate, because of course, for autistic people, that's really key. So I had 4 social prescribing sessions with Diane, and I know normally it's 3, but I think we decided that a 4th would be helpful. So DHI's social prescribing service, MyScript, helped me to connect to 5 amazing local agencies and organizations. So one of, and they're here. So the Wellbeing College, where I did some gentle yoga for a year and a half, Bath City Farm, where I went as a volunteer trustee, and Bath Community Gospel Choir, and I'm still there. So what's important about social prescribing is that it connects you to things that do not vanish the moment your mental health is a bit better. That's the difficulty with mental health services. This is about connecting and allowing you to build new networks, which creates independence. So if I take you through, the Wellbeing College allowed me to access some free gentle yoga classes. Now, I would never have thought of doing that who was I to go to yoga when I wasn't working? I was a single parent carer. My daughter was working and I wasn't. But what I came to understand was that actually leaving the house and being with people was an important part of my recovery. And also it became clear to me that I had become very dissociated from my body as part of the trauma, and gently finding a way back into my body was going to be valuable. Now, no one had ever talked about trauma in my body up until, I started to learn how my autism worked. So that was amazing. And I carried on with that. Bath Community Gospel Choir. So Diane had said, what did you used to like doing before you were unwell? And I said, well, I used to like singing. So we talked about me joining a choir, which is also a kind of classic social prescribing kind of idea, but I want to let you know how it worked. So this is the difference between signposting and social prescribing. Signposting would be join a choir, or here's a choir, or here are a few. With Diane, she understood I couldn't decide for myself which would be best. So she reduced it to 3 and helped me look at the 3 and make a decision. Now it happened that I knew someone from this choir, so that kind of stood out. We talked at length about how I would get out of my house, how I would get there, how I would go through the door, what I would say. Would my children be okay if I left? Of course they would, but in my hypervigilance, that was a concern. And then how, if I liked it, how would I go back a second time? So that's the coaching element that I needed. So it's not just about information, it's about how we do these things. Now, I am still a part of Bath Community Gospel Choir, and it gives me joy, community, the power of singing as well. So that is something I'm so grateful for all these years later. Now, Bath City Farm, at the time I lived near the Bath City Farm, and we talked about the fact I wasn't working and that I could volunteer. And it seemed like an easy, roughly an easy step to maybe to go to Bath City Farm. Now, I became a trustee, which suddenly meant that I had some structure, I had papers, I had the kind of recollection of what I used to do with working. It gave me a space to regain some of my confidence as a professional person, but also to develop some new skills as well. And eventually I became chair of trustees, which was an amazing privilege. It's just the most inspiring environment, and it connected me with nature as well. So that I wouldn't have thought about doing on my own, but I don't know how I would have got back to work if I hadn't done something that had helped me reconnect with the part of myself that that can be reliable, can be on time, can process thoughts and connect with others, etc. Now, importantly, there was the fact that I was really in a difficult financial and legal position. My GPs had never been interested in that in the past, but with social prescribing, Diane really helped me to stop being avoidant about those things. And we had this procedure where I would kind of put things in a metaphorical box. Then I got this actual box here, this lovely pink thing, and I chucked all of the debt letters, the problem letters in there, and I put it to one side until, time to time I had the energy to look at it and maybe take one thing out. Through that gentle process, it became clear that it would be really good to get help with benefits. So Diane helped me to access Bath Mind and Citizens Advice benefit service for people experiencing mental ill health. I work with them for at least 50 hours. There is no way that I would have got PIP, which I did eventually for 3 years, if it hadn't been for that support. I'm sure it's no news to any of you that the benefit system is unfathomably grueling and unfair. And in fact, since this recently, I've been working with Scope to tell them about my experience of applying for PIP as an autistic person experiencing mental ill health. And I've got to tell MPs about my experience, and they were horrified. So I did have to go to a tribunal and sit in a courtroom in front of a panel of 3 judges to tell them about my symptoms in order for the various rulings, judgments about my PIP eventually to be overturned. I just wouldn't have managed to do that if it hadn't been social prescribing me, helping me orientate myself into what I needed to focus on. Diane and I, lastly, decided to think about what an autism-friendly work-life balance might be for me and how I might begin my kind of 4-year journey back to full-time self-employment. So I want to say that part of my realization was that because of my long-term mental health and my autism, employment per se may never be something that is available to me. And that's a big thing to come to terms with, particularly with my family and my friends and so on. And self-employment is pretty arduous. But again, I decided to make that a focus and started on, with volunteering. I decided to retrain. I retrained as a mediator, which was also a way of kind of like thinking that I might be able to overcome some of my feelings of voicelessness and some of the disputes that I had been kind of subject to because of my mental health difficulties. I also became a mental health first aid instructor and worked at length with Bath Mind, gradually building up, doing bits and bits of training for them, and Resolve West doing bits and bits of mediation. So transitioning from volunteering to working with an amazing employment coach called Lorna. And that took 1 to 2 years. And I was on universal credit, which was very difficult. As a self-employed person on universal credit at that time, you could only make £200 profit. So there comes a point where you fall off that shelf. And that's difficult, I think, for us as autistic people who like to kind of crossfade. But after some 2 years, then I did move I came off benefits and went on to very flexible self-employed work. You'll see my little logo here, Arabella Tresillian Mediation, which someone helped me create. I was just doing little bits of work. But then I joined as an associate to an organization, the Medical Mediation Foundation, and again, was able to do little bits of work on my own. And then through more support, set up something called the School of Dialogue to provide mental health and conflict resolution training. And it's just to show you really the capacity that we all have really as autistic people, but the School of Dialogue won the Bath Life Awards for Best People Services. So it's not to flex or show off so much as to say, with the right support for us as autistic people, literally anything is possible. And it's about having, autism friendly support. So if, your clients are accessing DHI's service, know that this can be really life-changing, and that it can, or maybe people can come to you from being referred by DHI, and please don't underestimate the real power that you will have to help someone reorientate themselves. It's quite a kind of full-on scary world out there for many of us. The world is geared up for neurotypical people, but watch out. Neurodivergent people are finding their voice, finding their ways, changing workplaces, and our value in society is only beginning to be appreciated. So here is a picture of me at Bath City Farm having a great time. And I always want to say from the depths of my heart, thank you, Diane. Diane was my link worker, my social prescribing link worker, such a compassionate, kind, thoughtful person who helped me structure my action plan that I could take forward to help me in my own recovery, give me that agency. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening. I think Declan and I are going to take any questions that you'd like. Oh, Diane's here. Awesome. Hi, Diane.
I was going to say, Arabella, I wasn't sure if you'd seen, but yeah, Diane is kind of virtually with us, which is really lovely. Yes, so as Arabella said, please feel free to post any questions, and we'll answer them as they come in. It was one thing I just wanted to note in terms of Arabella mentioned MyScript. That is kind of, for all intents and purposes, now the mainstream social prescribing service. So it is still very much, whilst MyScript is not running, it transitioned to a kind of GP-based mainstream service. So it's largely the same thing that you engage with, Arabella, but yeah, just a different name.
Thank you.
I'll just check to see if there are any questions. It's largely, Arabella, a lot of people just thanking you for your kind of sharing your story with us.
Thanks,
perhaps
everyone.
we've been so clear that there are no questions, but really kind of lovely feedback in the chat. So yeah, I'd recommend reading that if you want to make your day.
I can see it from here. It's so nice. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, do if there's anything you want to ask me as well, this is, of course, you're so welcome. So Rachel says, we're only just seeing the potential of neurodiverse people in the workplace, and you have a superpower focus that some of us do not have. Yeah, and I think, thanks for that, Rachel. I think, if I can just share, I think there's a transition that we need to make often as autistic people. Often that superpower focus has been very much led by our amygdala, which is like focusing on like tracking our environments for difficulties or threats. And it took me a long time really to kind of learn about soothing and redirecting that focus towards the things that would be nurturing for me. But I think that can, people who have not yet had a diagnosis but have maybe come to this service will be have a real sense of the difficulties that we're facing. So it's about, that's why I love learning to kind of like repurpose that focus. Rachel says change the environment rather than the people. Yeah, so agree. Wonderful. Are there any parameters for people to receive social prescribing, e.g. who can access it? Declan, that's for you.
Yes, kind of anyone can access it. So within the kind of specialist social prescribing service, it's people currently waiting for an assessment with BAS who kind of have a BANES address. So kind of currently on the wait list for either assessment. So kind of waiting for an appointment with BAS and based in BANES. As I said, it's also now been opened up to people with a diagnosis within BANES, and that's the kind of specialist social prescribing service. And I suppose if you wanted to engage with social prescribing or had clients in mind, but they didn't meet those criteria, then as long as they have a BANES GP, then they can access the mainstream service. And yeah, it's as fantastic as her service as the specialist one is, if I may say so myself. And that was the service that Arabella you engaged with, and obviously kind of told us about. So yeah. There was another question around what organizations do to kind of improve access and remove barriers. Have you got anything, Arabella, that you kind of from having, I suppose, done it, was there anything that you found useful?
I guess that this phrase reasonable adjustments has become a really interesting one. My younger daughter now works for Scope, actually. So we've all become very interested in disability, and at Scope they've stopped talking about reasonable adjustments and they call them adjustments. And I think that's going to be a real game changer for organizations, not to talk about adjustments according to, oh, well, have you got a diagnosis, or have you, people having to disclose a disability, for example, but just a curiosity about the fact that any of us might need adjustments to make the environment more equitable for us. So it's only a case of a few simple questions around what would, make our service more accessible to you, or do you have any, requirements? Those sorts of questions not only show an openness to being flexible, but also invite people to say specifically what might be helpful. And that's always the beginning of a conversation. It's not to say that organizations have to do everything that the person necessarily says, but unless the organization starts the question, it's very hard for the individual to do so themselves. Would be one approach. What about you, Declan? What do you think?
One thing that I come across a lot working with clients is the way to get in touch kind of initially, and I think that's very much informed how I reach out to clients in the kind of first instance. And you mentioned that, Arabella, when you were speaking, in terms of giving people the option to let me know if a phone call is not the best way for them to engage, or likewise a face-to-face wouldn't be kind of their preference or whatever. So it's about giving as many options as you can. There are services that kind of only accept self-referral through a phone call, and for some people that's really challenging, and that means that they look at that and go, that's probably not for me then, and then potentially lose out on the support of that service, where had it been even a kind of an initial email to give that client an idea of what that initial conversation might entail, would perhaps be the kind of just that kind of push enough, or kind of not so much the push, I suppose, but the removal of that barrier could be enough to help them engage with it. There are obviously kind of sensory things as well, in terms of a kind of more physical environment, and that is very, very kind of individual. So Arabella, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of opening that conversation, and then doing as much to kind of make it doable for the client that you can.
I also think there's a real value for me personally in a meeting in kind of identifying the structure of the meeting and how it's going to go. I guess I do that in my own work now, because it's what I would want. I say, that at the beginning of the meeting, I'll say, we'll start by doing this, and then about halfway through we might talk about that, and then we'll definitely finish by X time. Does that work for you? And people seem to really like that, but for me it's like, that's profound. That makes such a difference if I know what the other person is expecting of how the meeting will go. But actually, as with many things, that which works for us as neurodivergent people tends to work for everyone. It's just, these are new ideas. So that kind of structure can be helpful too.
Yeah. I suppose the last call perhaps for final questions before we wrap up for today. Thank you for everyone that's kind of attended live. This has been recorded, so we'll upload it to our channels. So hello if you're watching from the future, the past, the future. Sorry,
there's I can see a question in the question box actually. So I'll quickly turn to that, shall I? To Arabella, have you noticed positive changes in the community and more awareness since your diagnosis? Massively so. Massively so. So if I can share about my daughter, and she's given me permission to talk about her in public, because we're both really interested in kind of people learning. She was initially not given a diagnosis, and when we looked into the criteria for diagnosis, it was basically, and that was maybe 2010, basically based on how it presents in boys, not even men, boys. So there's been a huge amount of research on how it looks in women, and therefore it's also helped us have a greater understanding of how diagnosis presents in in men, or people who identify as women or men. And interestingly, we have a lot of non-binary and non-gender conforming people within the autistic community. So these, the idea of what autism is transforming and is becoming much more accurate. And as it does so, people become much more interested in it as well, curiously. So yes, I have noticed a difference in terms of diagnosis and general interest and general acceptance and even excitement about neurodiversity in the workplace. I have to say my autistic daughter is excelling in her career. She is a software developer. When we have a diagnosis that works for us and we're able to work with it, then we really can thrive. And that message is getting across. The same with my daughter, who is deaf as well. Ideas about disability are changing, but there's more to be done. So thanks for that question.
And it is very much a work in progress, I think, isn't it,
hugely,
with everything.
Especially as it can take so long now that there's this awareness, there's a big backup for it can take so long to get a diagnosis. So I think it's really valuable for people to understand that whatever's autism friendly is available for everyone if they feel it would be helpful, whether or not they have a diagnosis.
And that's I mean, one of, not to continually bring it back to social prescribing, but that's something that's really key as part of this service is working with services that aren't specialist and aren't kind of diagnosis contingent, to make them more accessible to everyone. And then there are a lot of services that are really very, very good at that, especially in the Bath area. So that's really, really positive and kind of changing continually. And there's a lot of, I think, kind of almost introspection that services do, and kind of get on board kind of service user kind of feedback as well, just to increase that level of accessibility, which is always good. Always good. Lovely. I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for your time, Arabella, and kind of sharing your story with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, and as ever, thank you to DHI for the amazing work you do. It's really incredible. And thanks for everyone for joining us as well.
Indeed. Take care all. Bye-bye.
Bye.